This is The Toss-Up, where we take a look at some of the topics facing the world of sports and then we dive deeper. Whether it's your best friend's fantasy team or the future of college athletics, we're just trying to expand the conversation. We just want to look at the topics that keep you tuned in to the beautiful world of sports. This past Wednesday, a brand new world champion was crowned in the MLB. The Astros won their first World Series since joining the league in 1962. The Dodgers and Astros battled it out for 7 games and showed everyone why baseball is one of the most unpredictable and unique sports there are. Throughout the season, we saw home runs upon home runs upon home runs. 6,105 to be exact, which was a new MLB record. 52 of those were hit by a 6'7" Judge from the Bronx, but a Marlin from Miami decided to hit 7 more to take the lead. We saw a city in Houston that was devastated by Hurricane Harvey rally behind their team and will them to their first ever World Series championship. Isn't that why sports and baseball in general are just so great? A tragedy so catastrophic can knock out an entire community, but yet baseball found a way to unite that community by adding a little bit of excitement for a city that is thankful for just about anything. Today, we're going to spend some time recapping the past MLB season and some of the upcoming season as well. And on the panel today, I have with me Michael Dugan from the Assembly Call, Mark Timko from WIUX, and Austin Matricardi from IUS TV. And let's just dive right in, guys. First off, I want to get your initial thoughts on the season as a whole.
Well, the season as a whole was great for baseball. I mean, you look at the top 4 teams that were left in the playoffs, 4 biggest markets in baseball. The teams that made it, LA and Houston, obviously 2 of the 4 biggest markets in baseball. It was an epic series that went 7 games. It had everything. It had great pitchers' duels. It had a marathon Game 5. It had a little bit of everything. So this, I kind of, going into the season, people were thinking, okay, baseball's one great story, the Cubs, that's over. That story is over. The Cubs won 108 years. They won. There's nothing else intriguing about baseball. This postseason proved that narrative wrong. They still brought in great ratings, and it was a great 7-game series of entertainment.
In my opinion, this season in baseball, we kind of saw an evolution of the game. Because in the past, we've seen a lot of pitcher-heavy games where, it's like, oh, well, you have a really good pitcher. He's probably going to go out and get 7 or 8 innings, shut down baseball, and you're going to win the game. But this season, we saw kind of a new thing with the 3 true outcomes, so to say. You've got the home run, the walk, and the strikeout. As you said, Jacob, we saw a lot of home runs, but we also saw a lot of strikeouts. So instead of guys, hitting singles and, maybe stringing a few hits together, you just see a guy blast one over the fence, and that's how teams are scoring for the most part these days.
And I'll agree with something you said during your opening monologue about baseball is a general season, and I don't feel like, in most years, I feel like baseball is ramped up towards the World Series, where everybody will go and take the time out of their day to go and watch the postseason. But I think you touched on Hurricane Harvey, and I think that brought that Astros team and a lot of the rest of the country, too, to really go and touch on something that can unify rather than just kind of patter off into the distance. And I think it was definitely one of the best things for the game of baseball, honestly. And this season, and the postseason still helped out wonderfully as well. It's a 7-game series, like you said, a monster of a Game 5. I took more time than I usually do, usually during the postseason, to figure out and take the time and watch more of the postseason.
Now, obviously, last year's World Series was a great one, especially in Game 7. This one went to 7 games. We got to see another great series between the Dodgers and Astros. And just looking at the season, did you think the Astros were a surprise? And if not them, who are some other teams that might have been a little surprising?
Well, I think the Astros were a bit of a surprise. At least to me, I know people were expecting them to be good with guys like George Springer, Jose Altuve, and then they acquired Verlander in the middle of the season. People had some decently high expectations for the Astros. I don't know that many people had them winning the American League and then the World Series. I think there was a lot of hype toward Cleveland, and I think that they were probably my biggest surprise, but in a negative way. The way that They came running out of the gates after a strong finish last season and that enormous win streak they had on the second half of the season and came roaring into the playoffs. And then they just kind of plateaued, more or less. So I was expecting a lot more from Cleveland with that young core that really exploded last year and kept going this year, that outstanding rotation that was even better this year than they were last year. To see them kind of tail off in the postseason was surprising and disappointing to me from a baseball fan's perspective.
In my opinion, the most surprising team in baseball this season had to have been the Minnesota Twins. You look at a team that lost 101 games, I believe, in 2016, and then they come back and they make the postseason the next year. That had never been done before. That was an amazing turnaround by an organization that many people counted out at the beginning of the year to just come back and make it all the way to the wild card game despite their loss to the Yankees.
And I'll go back and I'll say, yeah, the Astros I think were probably one of my biggest surprises this season as well. To get to the World Series, it's a bit of a Cinderella story. You beat three of arguably some of the biggest teams in baseball right now. With some of the three highest payrolls, and you come back, you overtake everybody, and you win out a World Series like that. That was something surprising to me for sure.
Yeah, I want to stick with the Astros for a little bit because this Astros franchise, they were in the pits of despair a few years ago. They went to the draft, they had some good draft picks, and now those draft picks are finally flourishing, and obviously it paid off for them. Just talk about kind of the progress that they went through to get that World Series championship.
Oh, tremendous. It's an absolute Cinderella story, like you said. It's something that we can marvel at for years to come. And this is a new thing, more or less, that I'd say more teams now in baseball are going down this route than ever before. The White Sox are just starting to do this. I think they've got one of the best minor league systems across the entire sport. The Yankees did it, and they came up a year early, like you said. But this is something that these teams toward the bottom of their division are starting to do. And now we saw it with the Cubs. We've now seen it with the Astros 2 years in a row. This is something that has a proven track record, and it's something the teams are kind of lining up to do more or less now. It's exciting.
Well, if I remember correctly, there is an NBA franchise that likes to say, trust the process or something like that. The Astros trusted the process before that team. They went and they decided they were going to tear it down. They're going to, go to the draft, and that's how they're going to build their team. They went out and they drafted guys like George Springer. They drafted Alex Bregman, and the list goes on and on and on. And they just kept hitting on those draft picks. They rarely missed. It was just so tremendous. And I think that was the first success of their franchise before they even, all this success that they're having now. They really, really did well in the draft, and that's what set them up. And I think a lot of teams are starting to do that now, just like Michael said.
Now, looking at the season as a whole, Aaron Judge and Giancarlo Stanton, two of the biggest home run hitters, the two top home run hitters on the season. Just talk about kind of the impact they made, and then also that just them battling out for the whole season.
Well, I think it kind of brings that excitement factor back to the MLB, something that I guess the game was lacking for a little bit. No true sluggers. A lot of people are saying for years, baseball doesn't have this one big guy that they can go to, like the NBA has LeBron. The NFL has Tom Brady. The NHL has Sidney Crosby. The MLB didn't really have that guy, and it was probably Mike Trout, arguably the best player in baseball, but he plays for a terrible team in a market that doesn't really care about that team more than they do other teams. So to kind of have these guys be the center of attention, especially a huge guy like Stanton who can hit it out of any park he wants, and Judge, who's bigger than Rob Gronkowski and playing in New York wearing number 99. I mean, he has everything that there is to have if you want to be an up-and-coming star to kind of latch onto these young fans and help grow the game. So they are absolutely perfect for where the game is right now.
Yeah, and I mean, you look at that, you talked a little bit about Mike Trout, and while I agree that he is unequivocally the best player in the MLB, you already cited a few reasons as to why he isn't necessarily the face of the MLB, playing in Anaheim. His team's not that good, but he also doesn't really have like one of those big personalities. LeBron is like a big personality. And then you look at guys like Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton. They don't necessarily even need to have those big personalities because they're just so gosh darn big. You look at guys, though, like Francisco Lindor, Jose Altuve. Those guys are great for the game, too. Bryce Harper, they've got big personalities. They're so fun to watch. And I think that the development of some of those stars is what's bringing in some of the newer fans to the game.
Well, you talk about personalities, too. And, I mean, these guys, they just show off another sense of personality. They kind of bring in... But before, you're talking about baseball, and it's a long game, it's a grueling game. You got to sit through 9 innings, yada, yada, yada. And then you have these guys who kind of bring a new breath of life into the game. And guys like Aaron Judge and guys like I am so
Stanton.
Yeah, Stanton. I'm so sorry, just dropping the ball here. But guys like that who can bring a whole new breath of life into the game and actually make you enjoy sitting through 9 innings and watching a whole game of baseball is just so wonderful.
And earlier I was talking about the 3 true outcomes and that kind of evolution of the game. And those 2 that you mentioned are kind of the poster children of that. You look at Aaron Judge, and he hit 52 home runs this season, but if you talk to anybody that says that he shouldn't be the MVP, oh, well, he struck out so many times, and he broke the record for most games in a row with a strikeout and all this stuff. He hit 52 home runs. He led the American League in almost every single offensive statistic other than stolen bases. But people want to look at the strikeouts. So just looking at those 2, they're kind of a part of the 3 true outcomes. They're kind of where you see that the most.
Now we're going to stick with home runs here. 6,105, I mentioned earlier. Obviously, Giancarlo Stanton and Judge were a huge part of that. But there was a lot of talk with the new baseball this year. Do you think that had to deal with it a little bit as well?
I suppose there's certainly a chance. I mean, you bring something new to the game and then it immediately impacts the amount of home runs these guys are hitting. You can't count it out, but you also have to look at the guys that are hitting these home runs. Aaron Judge, Giancarlo Stanton combined for well over 100 of those home runs. These guys are massive human beings. You know, we have to take into account the size of these athletes, and they're the biggest they've ever been, the strongest they've ever been, the most athletic they've ever been. Guys like Anthony Rizzo, Nolan Arenado, all these guys are 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", 215, 230 pounds, are just mashing the ball. So the size of the athlete has to be taken into account. These guys are bigger than ever, more athletic than ever, but going back to the question, you know, bringing in something new to the game, obviously it has to affect it in one way or another.
Yeah, well, that certainly is a valid point that you made with, you know, the players being bigger, stronger, faster, and all this with all kinds of new training regimens and whatnot going in. The ball certainly has to be a part of that, in my opinion. Just because you look at a guy like, say, Didi Gregorius, who isn't bigger, stronger, or faster. He's the same size that he's always been, and he went out and he had a career year. I believe he hit like 30 home runs or something like that. He set the record for a Yankees shortstop. You also look at a guy like Brett Gardner, who's been a speed guy his whole career, and then he comes out and he just whacks 28 or whatever it was. It's interesting to see, obviously, the bigger guys, your Judges, your Stantons, they're going to go out and they're going to mash. But then you see some of the smaller guys, they're going out and they're doing it too, and that's what I really found interesting.
Well, I want to touch back on what you said with those big players, and they're really only going to keep getting bigger for that. So I only imagine that the number of home runs, if that's what is really causing it, is just going to go up. But we also, you bring up the point about them changing the ball, and I agree with you too, is that you change something and then something instantly changes with that, you have to take that into account. But then we look at the World Series too, and they changed the ball again for that. And I mean, we talk about this killer of a game in Game 5, and whether or not maybe the ball had something to do with that, you know, both teams getting more than 10 runs on each side. I mean, what was it, 12, 13? It's just insane. You have to take into account something like that. Who knows, maybe the balls just had a little extra something in them.
Now, a lot of the big stories, especially looking into playoff baseball, you have some mid-season trades. We saw Verlander, Quintana, Darvish, and JD Martinez get traded, and they are trying to do that to win some World Series. Obviously, that Verlander trade looked to work out pretty well.
That was definitely, you can take this one.
That Verlander trade was enormous. Because you look at their rotation before that, Dallas Keuchel's their top guy. You know, he's a little iffy sometimes. But you look at Verlander, he was nails for them in the playoffs. He didn't lose a game until the World Series. So just looking at somebody that can be that big for you and acquiring him in the middle of the season, that had to have been the best move of the season, really.
Had to have been. They were the team that came out on top. And Dallas Keuchel was their number one pitcher in the rotation for the World Series. Number 2 guy for the Dodgers, Yu Darvish, had a struggling World Series. Justin Verlander stepped up and pitched well for the Astros. And you say he had that loss in the World Series, but he was lights out the entire postseason. I forget which game it was. He went the distance and was completely dominant the whole way. So, I mean, obviously right out of the gates, he's the guy that got traded, that won his team a championship. All these pitchers getting moved around, Darvish, Verlander, Quintana, you mentioned all 3 of them. All those teams made those moves to win a championship. Obviously, Houston came out on top, and it wasn't necessarily because of Verlander, because there was so much going on, but he absolutely helped his team get further more than any other team.
Well, another thing, too, is you look at some of these teams that made it actually pretty far into the postseason, but some of them were still technically in their rebuilding years. And so I only expect more and more of these trades to come out. And again, it's the game of baseball. You don't really know exactly what's going to happen, right? Nobody's a fortune teller for this kind of thing. But the more midseason trades I'm going to anticipate, especially with these teams with these rebuilding years, I mean, who knows?
Now, just looking at the playoffs as a whole, the Yankees played very well. You have the bullpen situation, and I think Verlander plays into that one a little bit. How is the bullpen playing effect on the playoffs now compared to recent years?
Well, now I think they're leaning on it more. I think that's not a secret, and I love these Game 7s. I know we're spoiled with two pretty good, well, I mean, Wednesday night's Game 7 wasn't great, but back-to-back Game 7s to decide the World Series. These teams are dipping into their bullpen early, and I think it's exciting from a fan's perspective. If your starter doesn't have it, in a game in June or July, you'll kind of let him work it out, and maybe he starts to go off the rails a little bit. Then you dip into your bullpen, but it's exciting. Every pitch matters, and if your starting pitcher doesn't bring it, we saw Rich Hill for the Dodgers got pulled in the 5th inning through 58 pitches off one hit, and he got pulled. So the leash is definitely shorter for these starters. And these teams are absolutely dipping into their bullpens earlier, and I think it's exciting.
Well, the thing that was interesting to me is that throughout the postseason, we saw a few bullpens, kind of blow a few games, stuff like that. And I saw people saying, oh, well, now the game is all about offense. You have to have the bats, whatever, because in the past it had been bullpen-centric in the playoffs. I think that this playoffs has actually increased the importance of your bullpen. Because, sure, they might blow a few games, but starting pitching is just, it hasn't been very good in recent years. It's kind of fickle. It's either it's very good or it's very poor. You look at the American League wildcard game, Luis Severino is the Yankees' ace. He comes out and he gets one out, a single out. They go to their bullpen gets 26 outs and they win the game. That bullpen is so good, and it was just so crucial for that team. If they didn't have a bullpen that good, they wouldn't have won that game.
Well, anytime you talk about games dipping into six or seven game series, you have to talk about the bullpen. Obviously, it's just where you have these guys, they're getting tired, et cetera, et cetera. But I think one of the biggest reasons with a Game 7 win with the Astros is just because they had to dip so far into their bullpen, or the Dodgers had to dip so far into their bullpen, and I think the Astros were just able to take such a big advantage against something like that.
Yeah, I mean, you look at it, and playoff baseball, no matter what level you're at, is all about your pitching depth. You look at college baseball, some programs just run out of guys after 3 or 4 games in the tournament, and they're gone. It's the same way in the MLB. You look at it, and you have guys like Ken Giles and Kenley Jansen, but you can't pitch them every night. You have to have other guys in the game.
Now, one last thing I want to touch on, Game 5 of the World Series. Probably one of the best baseball games I think Americans or anyone has ever seen. Obviously, the bullpens didn't hold up too well on that. How was that for you guys watching Game 5?
It was the best postseason baseball game I've ever seen. And I'm a huge Cubs fan, and I loved Game 7 last year. While it wasn't good for my heart rate, it was great entertainment, and it obviously ended well. But that had everything from the start. And I know both those games went to extra innings, but, I mean, it was just back and forth. There was more action than last year's Game 7, which I thought was probably the second best playoff game I've ever seen. And then you have to talk about David Freese for the Cardinals years back. That was also great. Those, I think, are the 3 best of our lifetime, at least in recent history. But that Game 5 was, 5 hours and 20 minutes? I wasn't bored for more than 20 seconds. Mm-hmm. Like, I was watching that game in its entirety, and I was not bored once. That's incredible for a 5-hour game.
Yeah, I mean, you look at it, and from the perspective of a casual fan, that game was tremendous. That game was just so good for the game of baseball because it had everybody talking about it. Oh, did you watch Game 5? Oh, it was 13-12. Oh, they hit so many home runs. Oh, they came back. Oh, well, the other team came back. There was just so much that went on, and it just got people talking about the game of baseball, and I think that's just really good for the MLB as a whole.
For sure. I honestly think that Game 5 was one of, even if you're a casual fan, even if you're a hardcore fan, personally, I like lower scoring baseball games. But seeing something like that, sure, it's a 5-hour game, and you sit through that whole thing, there's always something for everybody, whether you like your pitching game to be stronger, whether you like your big hits. I mean, a 12-13 game, obviously there's so much that was going on in a game like that. Everybody could have loved something in that.
All right, so coming up after the break, our panel will preview the 2018 MLB season. Stick with us. Welcome back to the toss-up. We just got done recapping this past MLB season, but now we want to delve into a little bit of a preview for next season. So first off, what are some possible offseason trades that might happen?
Well, I know from my neck of the woods, there's been a little bit of chatter of whether or not the Cubs should trade Kyle Schwarber. I mean, some people are high on this, some people are not so high on it. There's one side that says his stock, if he continues down the trend he went down last season of basically a home run or a strikeout, his stock will never be higher. And there are some people are saying his value of boom or bust toward the end of that, the middle of that lineup is just too high to trade at this point. So that's a name that, hey, locally for Bloomington, that's a big name. But just for the landscape of baseball as a whole, with the Cubs being one of those top teams, and that's one of the game's top sluggers when he's really feeling it, that's a pretty big trade that could happen. It's unlikely, but there's still a little bit of chatter there.
I believe that another organization that you have to look at almost undoubtedly is the Miami Marlins. They're under new management. Derek Jeter's ownership group has just taken control, and they've got some big contracts on the books, and they might be looking to rebuild. They've got a guy named Giancarlo Stanton. I know that we talked about him a little bit earlier. He might be on the market, and moving him would just be absolutely, that would be a huge landscape shift no matter where he goes. They also have D. Gordon, another guy who's maybe a little underappreciated, but he's also a former All-Star that could be on the move as well.
And you beat me to mine because I was going to talk about Kyle Schwarber too, who's been underperforming all of last season really. They stepped him down to a AAA league a little while ago, comes back, starts to do a little bit better, and then just kind of stays. And I think that he would probably be better going to another team. Maybe the Cubs aren't the right fit for Kyle Schwarber, and maybe he could do somewhere better that's just at a slightly lower quality team, I guess. Yeah. I'm a big Cubs fan myself, and I think that Kyle Schwarber has done great for the Cubs, but maybe he's better off somewhere else.
Yeah, it could be argued that Kyle Schwarber would be a better fit in an American League environment just because of the fact that he's obviously a very solid hitter when he's on, but his fielding can be considered lackluster by some. So just looking at him maybe going to a place like, New York, playing for the Yankees maybe, his lefty power in that ballpark would just be lights out. He would hit 50 home runs possibly. So it's just an interesting thing where, looking at his suitors, they're almost all going to be from the American League.
Yeah, I was just going to say, he's a total liability defensively. So that's got to be really, really attractive to American League teams to think that you could bring that kind of power to the plate and not have to throw him in the field.
Now, you mentioned Stanton earlier. If you're Stanton and you're on the Miami Marlins and you might be considering possibly wanting to be traded to a better team because your talents are much better somewhere else other than Miami. But you also got to think, we brought up Mike Trout earlier. Obviously, he's signed to a long deal. But Mike Trout and Stanton, do you ever think those guys could leave where they're at right now to try to go to a winning team?
I think there's a chance because there are some teams that, they have a hole to fill. Maybe they can't produce as many runs that, to keep up with this elite pitching that's kind of ruling baseball right now. You have the Astros, we talked about them, the Dodgers, we talked about them, and Cleveland has a pretty solid rotation as well. So there are teams out there that are just on the outside looking in that could use a couple extra runs. And not to mention Mike Trout's fielding ability. He's a tremendous outfielder. He's a great defender, great defensively. So there are certainly teams that would spend a lot of money to win now that can win now while all these other teams are building for the future.
You look at Mike Trout, and I don't know if he's necessarily going to get moved. I could certainly see it happening, but it would cost a king's ransom. It would have to be one of the biggest trades in the history of the league. Giancarlo Stanton, though, I actually can legitimately see him being moved this offseason. You look at maybe the Cleveland Indians, you look at the Cubs, you look at the Yankees, you look at the Red Sox. Those are all teams that are trying to win right now. And having that huge bat in the middle of their lineup would be monumental for them. So I can see Giancarlo Stanton moving quickly.
Well, I would agree with that, but you say it like they're still going to not have to pay a pretty penny for a guy like that who still is such a high stock right now. I agree. Probably he would end up going to somewhere like the Yankees, like the Red Sox, teams that are really looking to go forward into that postseason and actually capitalize on the players that they have. But it's probably going to be tough getting them out of a team that's got such big talent and such high stock in a player like that.
Looking at it that way, Mike Trout certainly has more value than Giancarlo Stanton. Stanton does have a lot of value, though. But in my opinion, teams know that the Marlins may be trying to move to a rebuild. So maybe, they can't be like, oh, well, it'll be less. The cost will be less just because teams know that the Marlins may be trying to move him. But he will still certainly be at high value, of course.
Now, if we look at a couple of the contenders possibly for next year, obviously the Dodgers, runner-ups this year, lost in the CS last year to the Cubs, who were eventual champions, lost in the DS the year before that to the Mets, who went to the World Series. The Dodgers could be contenders. The Astros could be contenders. Who are some other contenders that you see coming in next year?
I think those two are the top two. You have the Dodgers, obviously, with that rotation. We'll see what happens with Yu Darvish in the offseason because he was pretty iffy in the World Series. Those are the top two, and I have to throw Cleveland back in there. Last year they come off of heartbreak coming into this year, and they fall completely flat on their faces in the playoffs. They've got to be playing angry next season. They still have a great young core of players and a rock-solid rotation. So the next team up, I think, has got to be Cleveland.
In my opinion, obviously there's still a lot of things that are going to happen between now and then. The landscape could shift 2 or 3 times. But just looking right now, the New York Yankees appear to be another one of those contenders. Cleveland is obviously going to be one as well, in my opinion. But the Yankees have Aaron Judge. They've got Gary Sanchez. They've got a tremendous young core that they're building around. And this offseason, they should be looking to go out and kind of grab some pieces to highlight Judge, Sanchez, and those young players.
And another name that I kind of want to bring up that might be a little bit less talked about, but the Washington Nationals did a very, very good job in the postseason this year. I'll say I think that they're playoff contenders for next year. I'm not saying they're going to be World Series champions. Maybe if they can capitalize on some of the players that they have and still kind of add more into that team, sure, maybe you could see them in a World Series in the next 5 years. But I can see them in the playoffs still. I think their quality of their team is just somewhere in that postseason but not quite World Series championship.
Now let's take a little bit closer look at some of the players, possibly players from last year, new players coming in from the draft, whatever it may be. Who are some players that are going to make an immediate impact coming into the season next year?
Well, I already mentioned him. I'm looking at Cody Bellinger for the Dodgers. Obviously, it's no secret the Dodgers have come close, but they haven't pulled through in the last couple of years in the postseason. This was a guy that was tremendous this year, shattered all expectations, I'm sure, for everyone. And, he's a young guy, 23, I believe, a young guy in L.A., and that's a loaded lineup with a lot of hitters for the Dodgers, from him, Seager, Puig. I mean, this is a capable lineup in L.A., and if he can improve off of what he did this season, which is much easier said than done, they have to be the odds-on favorite.
In my opinion, if you look at some of the young guns around the league, you want to look at the Chicago White Sox. Players like Yohan Moncada, Michael Kopech, those should be guys that we're looking at that maybe break onto the scene next year, because the White Sox probably aren't looking to win next year. So they're going to bring up some of their young prospects. So those two should get loads of playing time next year, and I think that they have a chance to break out.
And you stuck me with the White Sox, too. Again, you guys are reading my mind, I swear tonight. But there are a lot of new faces on that team, and for sure they can definitely bring up something just kind of, I wouldn't say out of the grave. I wouldn't say that the White Sox are doing terrible. But definitely new faces like that can just breathe new life into a team. I think they've got a good quality chance at showing off themselves this year.
And if you look back to New York, they already have some of those young guys up there. We've talked about Judge, we've talked about Sanchez, Severino, but they still have more young guys coming. You look at a Gleyber Torres, who's the top prospect in baseball. He hasn't made his MLB debut yet. He'll be coming up next season. You look at Clint Frazier. He has made his MLB debut, but he should be able to come up next year, get consistent playing time, and I believe that he could be one of the most dynamic players in the MLB because he has a great skill set.
And I want to bring up one more guy for the White Sox who's in their minor league system whenever he's going to break through is Eloy Jimenez. This guy can mash the ball unlike anyone I've seen at the minor league system in a long time. There was a video, I think, that came out in July. He hit a home run during batting practice that shattered the top light of the stadium lights outside of the ballpark. This guy can mash the baseball, and he's going to be exciting whenever he does come up.
That kind of sounds like Aaron Judge.
Yeah.
I'm going to stick in the Cincinnati system because they have two guys named Jesse Winker and Nick Zenzil. Nick Zenzil played a lot of AA ball this year, played very good baseball, and then Jesse Winker had some time in AAA, had some time up in the majors. Two very good players, but man, Cincinnati, they need to figure out the pitching rotation. But moving on, We don't have anything else, but do you guys have any other final thoughts?
Well, I think just overall this season, the World Series, the postseason, was really, really good for baseball. I touched on it earlier, but I can't emphasize it enough. The fact that baseball's one big storyline being gone after last postseason with the Cubs, they followed through this year. They still brought in great ratings. They attracted the casual fan with that Game 5 of the World Series. It went 7 games. There were all the right reasons to watch this postseason for baseball in a game that in the last couple of years we thought was just going to fade away to football. Well, Game 5 of the World Series, I think, got higher ratings than Sunday Night Football. I mean, that's a pretty good indicator right there. Now, granted, it's the World Series and a huge stage. That goes without saying. But that's a very promising sign for a game that was supposedly on the downfall that now I think is trending back upward.
Looking at, some of the newer players, you touched on the Cincinnati system, Jacob, and another player that they just recently drafted, Hunter Green, is one of the most intriguing prospects in baseball. He's a good hitter, he's a good pitcher, and I think that there's actually a few players around the country that are actually kind of in that mold. You look at Brendan McKay, who was drafted out of Louisville by the Tampa Bay Rays. He's another one of those players that are kind of exciting and bring a new dynamic to the game. And of course, there's the Japanese player Shohei Ohtani, who may not be coming over this season, but he's definitely one that baseball fans should be looking out for.
And I think that a season in a World Series like 2017 put out is true. It's attracted more casual fans to the MLB than maybe it has in the past years. And I think that's only going to be good for the MLB because some people are going to be now more excited for the next season, for the very beginning of the next season. I'm not going to say you're going to get as great of ratings as maybe Game 5 of just the World Series here, but I think it's only going to bring more and more attention to a baseball league that's probably fading a little bit more towards the NFL. So I'll be excited for the new season to start. I'll be watching it more myself. That's really all I have.
So one MLB season comes to an end. The Astros on top. We looked ahead at the next season coming up. Should be another interesting one, but that's going to do it for the show this week. Be sure to continue the discussion on our Twitter page at IUSTV Sports and on Facebook at IUSTV Sports. You can always give any suggestions for the show and ask any questions you might have. Toss it up. Find out if we'll catch it. We'll see you next Sunday.